Section 1. Hey guys, tonight we're going to dim the lamps, tiptoe back into the soft shadows of 18th century Europe, and unravel one of the strangest food taboos history ever chewed on. Why people back then were genuinely afraid, yes, afraid, of eating salad after sunset. You stroll through an old market square. The stalls are closed, the produce long gone, but the whispers remain. Lettuce, they say, can chill your blood. Cucumbers after dusk, might as well sign your will. There's no thunderclap, no shrieking banshee, just a quiet, leafy terror rustling under the surface of polite society. And you probably won't survive this story, at least not with your respect for kale intact. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd love to know where you're listening from and what time it is there. Drop a comment with your city and local time. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're drifting along cobblestone alleys under the pale orange glow of lanterns. The year is 1764, and you're somewhere in Austria, probably regretting that second helping of roasted turnips. You overhear a whispered warning between two bonneted ladies as they eye the droopy heap of arugula left behind at the market. No one of good sense eats greens after dusk. It sounds absurd to your modern ears, but in this strange cabbage-scented era, salad at night wasn't just frowned upon, it was downright dangerous. To truly understand this leafy phobia, you have to dive into a time when science was less peer-reviewed and more Pierre says it's true. The fear wasn't just about flavor or freshness, it was metaphysical, philosophical, medical. It was deeply tied to the era's dominant health doctrine, the humoral theory. Now don't panic, we're not going to quiz you, but you do need a sleepy little crash course. In the 18th century, most European physicians still clung tightly to the ancient notion that your body is governed by four fluids: blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm. Each had its own temperament, its own vibe. Ideally, they should all vibe together like a well-balanced indie band. But if you ate something cold when your body was feeling too wet, or something moist when your spleen was feeling fiery, well, congrats, you've just sentenced yourself to a 3-week illness and a lifetime of distrust towards cucumbers. And salads? They were the coldest, wiltiest, slipperiest offenders of them all. There's a story, probably apocryphal, though historians still argue whether it ever actually happened, of a young nobleman in Naples who consumed a spinach salad after sundown and fell into such a chill that his servants had to bury him in warm sand. Not that it helped. The next day, his complexion turned green. Not metaphorically, literally. Even if your digestion was Olympic tier strong, greens were said to weaken your internal fires overnight. Vital heat, they called it. You know, the warm, glowing force inside you that kept your limbs mobile, your organs loyal, and your dreams less terrifying. And so began the era of leafy green suspicion. Cooks were advised to boil lettuce before sundown if they had to serve it. Doctors warned that celery after dinner could dissolve the stomach's courage. And God forbid you ever chopped fennel after dark. The herbalists claimed it whispered back. A particularly dramatic pamphlet printed in London in 1748 warned, "He who consumes verdant leaves by lamplight hath invited death to dine before morning." Catchy, right? Makes you wonder why it never got turned into a pub name. Now, keep in mind, refrigeration didn't exist. Salads were often wilty and sketchy or crawling with microscopic horrors that no one understood yet. So the nightly salad ban may have accidentally helped people avoid genuine foodborne illness. But that's not why they did it. They did it because salad had vibes, and those vibes were dangerous. Picture this. You're sitting in an old apothecary shop. Shelves are stacked high with jars labeled dragon's tongue and powder of ox gall. A frazzled man bursts in, clutching his stomach and whispering that he ate a raw endive salad at twilight. The apothecary doesn't blink. He reaches for a poultice made of goose fat and crushed mint, and while you try not to gag, he mutters, "Should have had broth instead." And you nod, because that makes perfect sense. The real kicker. Many of these fears were passed down through generations, not just in medicine but in folklore. Mothers warned daughters, don't eat what the moon can see. Herbalists claimed certain leaves grew sinister after sunset. And some households even locked their pantries to stop late-night lettuce raids. Yes, lettuce raids, the crispest of crimes. So here you are, a modern listener, lying in bed, wondering how a plate of mixed greens could cause such mass paranoia. It's funny, it's weird, but somewhere in the mix is a very human story about how much we want control over our bodies, our sleep, and that unpredictable churning furnace we call a digestive system. Tomorrow, you'll probably eat a salad with dinner. You'll be fine. Probably. But for now, rest easy knowing that you live in an age where your kale won't betray you. At least, not before midnight.
Section 2. You wander deeper into the winding, sleepy alleys of 18th century thought, the lamplight flickering against your slippers as we settle into the tangled logic of the four humors. If you've ever heard someone described as sanguine or melancholic, congratulations, you've brushed up against this centuries-old theory. Tonight, you're not just a passive listener. You're a walking cocktail of bodily fluids. Charming, right? According to this time-honored medical doctrine, your entire well-being depends on the balance between four invisible forces inside you: blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm. And yes, it's exactly as glamorous as it sounds. Each humor was linked to different temperaments and behaviors. Too much blood, you're cheerful and rosy. Too much black bile, hello, brooding poet. Phlegm, you're basically an 18th century couch potato. And yellow bile? Let's just say that's where your inner rage monster lives. Now, food didn't just feed you, it altered your internal chemistry. And the greens you eat, especially at night, were believed to be cold and moist. You, trying to sleep peacefully, needed to be warm and dry. See the problem? Salad was like inviting a wet towel into your personal furnace. You're not just risking indigestion, you're threatening your entire temperament. According to the wildly confident medical texts of the day, eating lettuce after sundown would douse your vital heat, that cozy bonfire in your belly that kept everything, including your soul, in working order. If it got too damp or cold in there, your blood might stagnate, your thoughts might turn sluggish, your very identity might erode into something leafy. And if that is enough to make you rethink your 9 p.m. kale habit, let's toss in a bit of psychological flair. Physicians warned that improperly balanced humors led to madness. Real, institutional grade, wear a nightcap and scream at the fireplace madness. So naturally, the equation became simple. Late-night salad equals madness. Historians still argue whether this fear was purely medical or if it got tangled with moral anxieties too. After all, anything that chilled the blood was also said to weaken character, dull the senses, and open the door to temptation. And what's more tempting than a midnight snack of contraband lettuce? A fringe medical pamphlet from Prussia claimed that lettuce renders the mind too tranquil, eroding the manly virtues of firmness and resolve. Sounds oddly personal, doesn't it? Like someone lost an argument and blamed the arugula. Let's not forget that digestion was an epic ordeal in this era. Meals weren't eaten lightly or quickly. A well-to-do dinner might stretch over 3 hours, with multiple courses and wine flowing like gossip. Afterward, people took slow walks or even lay down, but always with the warning, don't eat anything afterward, especially not salad. You can almost hear the dinner guests. Another slice of lamb? Yes. A plum tart? Certainly. A crisp little endive? Do you want me dead, Margaret? Of course, this terror had ripple effects in how people planned their entire day. Cooks were instructed to prepare salads only for midday service, when the sun was highest and the body's humors were at their most forgiving. No one wanted to deal with an emergency leeching session just because Uncle Tobias had a late-night radish. And then there were the rules. So many of them. You could eat spinach, but only if it was wilted. You could nibble a bit of chicory, but only if it had been tossed with warmed oil. Cold dressings? Out of question. Vinegar, sure, but not lemon. Too sharp, too acidic, too capable of turning your brain to pudding. And let's talk about cucumbers. These poor, defenseless tubes of water were treated like portable disease grenades. Eating one after dark was considered reckless at best, suicidal at worst. One 1772 British medical journal claimed that cucumbers inflame the stomach by day and extinguish the soul by night. Are you picturing that? A cucumber extinguishing your soul like a candle snuffed out by a damp breeze? By now, you might be wondering if this was all just a misunderstanding. Maybe they didn't wash their vegetables properly. Maybe the greens were harboring little friends too small to see. And sure, foodborne illness was absolutely a thing back then. But their explanation for post-salad discomfort was always framed in the dramatic language of humors and mystical balance, not hygiene. You might chuckle at the silliness, but think about your own life. How many wellness gurus today warn against eating after 8 p.m.? How many tell you to warm your digestion with ginger tea and avoid cooling foods at night? History doesn't end. It just changes clothes. You sit now with your blanket up to your chest, wondering if your spinach wrap at dinner was a mistake. It wasn't, but your 18th century ancestors would probably stage an intervention, and it would involve mint compresses, sage-burning rituals, and someone gently but firmly locking your salad spinner in a cupboard. For them, every meal was a test, not just of taste or nutrition, but of spiritual fortitude. Salad at noon? Virtuous. Salad at night? Reckless. A man might survive war, heartbreak, and taxation, but a moonlit romaine leaf? That was playing with fire, or rather, putting out your fire. So you wander on through this strange era, past tightly closed kitchens, shadowy herb gardens, and deeply suspicious farmers who pluck their crops only under sunlight. You begin to see the world through their eyes. The moon is not just a light in the sky. It's a meddler, a salad spoiler, a silent accomplice to digestive chaos. And as you drift toward sleep, you can't help but smile at the sheer persistence of belief. How one soggy leaf, eaten at the wrong hour, could tip the balance of body and mind. Don't worry, we're only just getting started. The night has many more vegetables to betray. Section 3. You move from the alleys of superstition into the tiled corridors of 18th century medicine, where doctors in powdered wigs and unnecessarily tall shoes confidently deliver declarations that today would make your local nutritionist spit out their kale smoothie. Here, a salad is not a food, it's a provocation. You find yourself in a candlelit examination room, air thick with rosemary and regret. A young woman sits on the examination bench, pale as milk and convinced she's dying. The cause? A dandelion leaf, eaten cold after supper. The physician, a man whose qualifications include Latin fluency and probably zero actual anatomy experience, leans over her and mutters, "The greens have unbalanced her vapors." And that's the thing. They really believed that. Let's slow this down. One of the key assumptions in pre-modern European medicine was that everything you ingested had a direct emotional effect, and not in the comfort food sense. More like eat too much parsley and you become overly amorous, consume excessive cabbage, and melancholy sets in. Celery? It stirs the blood, possibly in ways that should only be discussed after marriage. Historians still debate whether these effects were ever systematically observed or just socially repeated into truth. But if you tell someone often enough that cucumbers will make them hysterical at night, eventually someone's going to have a dramatic night with a cucumber. Now, some salads were considered riskier than others. Watercress was a bit of a loose cannon. Too peppery, too unpredictable. Endive? Acceptable in daylight, dangerous by moonlight. Dandelion leaves were said to summon strange dreams. Some even claimed they opened the soul to ghostly visitations.
A diary from a French noblewoman in 1759 mentions a terrifying episode in which she dreamed her late husband was trapped inside a head of cabbage. She wrote, "He wept and pleaded to be boiled." Now, was it the lettuce or the grief, or perhaps a side effect of powdered wig glue? We'll never know. In cities like Vienna and Florence, night salads were sometimes associated with the upper class, who had the luxury of ignoring common sense and indulging in post-dinner frivolities. That meant a second supper, an after-supper fruit bowl, and, if they were particularly daring, cool herbs chopped into cold oils. This habit was widely frowned upon. Moralists claimed that nighttime salad eating wasn't just unwise, but decadent, a sign that you had too much money, too much ego, and not enough fear of dying from damp lettuce. And, of course, the church had opinions. Monastic food rules varied widely, but in certain Benedictine circles, eating raw greens at night was discouraged during fasts because it encouraged the devil to loosen the bowels. That's an actual phrase from a monastery record. So, yes, somewhere a monk was scolding another monk for eating sinful spinach. Doctors were no more lenient. A popular medical text from 1761, titled The Guide to Proper Physical Habits of the Season, warned that nighttime salads agitate the bile and usher forth darkened thoughts, which sounds like the tagline for a Victorian horror film. And let's not forget the aphrodisiac panic. Several vegetables common to salads, parsley, basil, and fennel, were believed to rouse unseemly appetites if consumed at night. So while lettuce dulled the vital fire, certain herbs were thought to stoke it. The risk was not just dying in your sleep. The risk was dreaming improper dreams and waking up with your humors in disarray and your reputation in peril. This created a kind of culinary paradox. You wanted to be healthy, but not too healthy in the wrong direction. You wanted balance, but not temptation. You could eat greens to cleanse the body, but too late, and they'd cleanse your soul right into trouble. Some households developed peculiar rituals to sidestep this issue. They'd warm salads under lanterns, bless the olive oil, or recite a calming psalm while eating. One English household in 1338 insisted that every member chew basil precisely 32 times to calm the liver. You can almost hear it. 1, 2, 29, 30. No, don't swallow yet, Georgina. You'll anger the spleen. And still, even in this sea of superstition, there were skeptics. Enlightenment thinkers, those early science nerds, started to question the great leafy terror. Some wrote papers suggesting that maybe it wasn't the greens, but the pork fat dressing that caused those long, horrible nights. One rogue philosopher in Berlin even claimed the real problem was overheating the digestion, not cooling it. He was politely ignored and then likely invited to fewer dinners. Still, small cracks began to form. Some urban apothecaries started encouraging salad eating for the well-disposed belly. A few scandalous pamphlets even suggested that greens could ease nightmares if paired with a warm broth and a glass of cordial. Progress, it seems, was a slow, leafy revolution. But for most of the century, the fear remained. Leafy things at night were viewed the way we might view a stranger offering unwrapped candy in the parking lot. Suspicious, risky, possibly fatal. Imagine sitting at a long oak table with candlelight flickering across porcelain dishes. The roast is gone. Dessert has been cleared. A servant brings out a plate of slightly wilted spinach with lemon and oil. Everyone stiffens. No one moves. Someone coughs. The hostess smiles politely and says, "Well, I suppose we're all very brave tonight." And so the fork hovers. Will it be taken? Or will the spinach go untouched, left as a silent tribute to mortality and collective anxiety? You, lounging here in bed with your warm socks and steady digestion, probably think this is all hilarious. But be honest, Haven't you once hesitated before eating something a few hours old, or wondered whether that cold potato salad really was still good? Maybe there's a trace of your powdered wig ancestors in you after all. So rest easy, for now, because tomorrow we go underground, literally, roots and tubers, and trust me, the turnip's reputation is about to get shredded.
Section 4. You descend now from leafy fears into the damp, earthy realms of underground vegetables. Roots, tubers, bulbs, the lurking suspects beneath every well-meaning salad. If greens were risky, root vegetables were ambiguous. Neither entirely cold nor wholly warm, more like culinary double agents. Picture this. You're an 18th century European aristocrat, yes, again, reclining after a long dinner. The fire crackles, your stockings itch slightly. A servant enters bearing a dish of boiled turnips, garnished with parsley. You smile politely. You will not be sleeping tonight. The turnip, humble as it seems, had a reputation. Not one it earned honestly, but rather inherited from centuries of folklore and rural suspicion. While greens were risky, root vegetables were ambiguous. Neither entirely cold nor wholly warm, more like culinary double agents. Picture this. You're an 18th century European aristocrat, yes, again, reclining after a long dinner. The fire crackles, your stockings itch slightly. A servant enters bearing a dish of boiled turnips, garnished with parsley. You smile politely. You will not be sleeping tonight. The turnip, humble as it seems, had a reputation. Not one it earned honestly, but rather inherited from centuries of folklore and rural suspicion. While greens were risky, root vegetables were ambiguous. Neither entirely cold nor wholly warm, more like culinary double agents. Picture this. You're an 18th century European aristocrat, yes, again, reclining after a long dinner. The fire crackles, your stockings itch slightly. A servant enters bearing a dish of boiled turnips, garnished with parsley. You smile politely. You will not be sleeping tonight. The turnip, humble as it seems, had a reputation. Not one it earned honestly, but rather inherited from centuries of folklore and rural suspicion. While greens were risky, root vegetables were ambiguous. Neither entirely cold nor wholly warm, more like culinary double agents. Picture this. You're an 18th century European aristocrat, yes, again, reclining after a long dinner. The fire crackles, your stockings itch slightly. A servant enters bearing a dish of boiled turnips garnished with parsley. You smile politely. You will not be sleeping tonight. The turnip, humble as it seemed, had a reputation. Not one it earned honestly, but rather inherited from centuries of folklore and rural suspicion. While greens were not universally banned like lettuce after dark, root vegetables were viewed as disruptors, wild cards in the fine-tuned balance of your four precious humors. Turnips, beets, carrots, radishes, these weren't neutral side dishes. They were considered moistening, sometimes even fermenting in the gut. Eaten raw, they were thought to agitate phlegm and disturb dreams. Eaten cooked, they were marginally safer if paired with the right warming spices, caraway, clove, or nutmeg. Historians still argue whether these beliefs stemmed from genuine observation or a blend of monastic texts and seasonal indigestion. After all, winter diets leaned heavily on roots, so late-night discomfort was simply a matter of overeating boiled food and blaming the nearest parsnip. But oh, the parsnip! It got off surprisingly easy. Unlike the beetroot, which had a very curious nickname in parts of rural France, the midnight bruiser. That's right, it was said to cause night sweats, vivid dreams, and, in one pamphlet, romantic seizures.
To be clear, no one could define what a romantic seizure was, but the illustrations strongly implied swooning and lace. A particularly odd medical treatise from 1744 claimed that eating raw beetroot in the evening would cause the brain to oversteam its watery parts, encouraging thoughts of rebellion and lust. Another blamed it for nocturnal complaints of the lower joints, which might be a euphemism or just a very creative way of saying leg cramps. Meanwhile, radishes were viewed with a kind of puzzled suspicion. Some said they cooled the liver, others said they excite the gall, and many simply avoided them entirely at night, lest they turn to wind. That's not a metaphor. They literally feared root vegetables would generate disruptive air in your gut, which would then roam the body like a mischievous ghost, waking you at inconvenient hours with stomach pangs and, presumably, regret. You begin to see the pattern, don't you? No vegetable was innocent. They were all weighed on invisible scales of thermal effect and moral resonance. Garlic? Energizing, but too stimulating at bedtime. Onions? Slightly warming, possibly tear-inducing, but never raw past sunset. Potatoes? Mercifully uncontroversial, largely because most people didn't have them yet. The potato was still in its "wait, is this a witch's egg?" phase across parts of Europe. Many rural communities feared them simply because they were new and vaguely foreign, with suspicious eyes and a disturbing ability to sprout in cupboards. The more conservative rural physicians believed that root vegetables burrowed into your organs the way they did into soil, insidiously and with intent. They weigh the body low and draw the spirits earthward. A poetic way of saying you'll sleep badly and feel sad tomorrow. Meanwhile, in German-speaking regions, there were even bedtime vegetable charts, tables listing acceptable produce by hour. A carrot might be fine at 3 p.m., but at 8 p.m.? A regretful choice. That was the official phrasing in the Viennese cookbook. Imagine your groceries being judged for poor timing. And it wasn't just folklore. Professional chefs got involved too. In households with a personal cook, it was common for them to adjust the evening menu specifically to calm the digestion. That meant avoiding strong oils, tart vegetables, or anything with excessive root. But here's the twist. Sun roots weren't feared, they were revered. Valerian root, for instance, was dried and used to calm nerves and ease sleep. So not all underground edibles were cast out. Some were welcomed into the night ritual if they came in the form of tinctures, teas, or faintly bitter stews. It was all about form, context, and intent. A carrot in a broth was nourishing. A carrot in a cold salad was practically a call for divine intervention. You imagine the nightly caution practiced by households of the time. Kitchen maids glancing at the hour before chopping herbs. Matrons whispering about whether to risk another beat. Elderly aunts clutching their rosaries when someone dared to mention pickled radish. All this over food. And yet, doesn't it feel familiar? How many dietary warnings do you scroll past in a single day now? No carbs after 7. No sugar at bedtime. No gluten unless it's ethically massaged by a certified baker. The dance of diet and fear is timeless. It just changes flavor. Now close your eyes and picture it. An 18th century dining table lit by flickering wax, dishes cleared, candlesticks leaning just so, and in the hallway, a humble servant hurries past carrying a plate of unserved turnips. Too late! The lady of the house decided to err on the side of spiritual dryness. You smile. You do the same. Tomorrow we climb out of the soil and into the treacherous world of dressing, not clothing, but oil, vinegar, and the dangerous dance of condiments after dark.
Section 5. You sit now at the polished edge of an 18th century table, watching the flicker of candlelight dance across cut glass cruets. Inside them, liquid danger. Oil,
vinegar, maybe even a dab of mustard. Each drop a calculated risk. Welcome to the strange and slippery world of salad dressings after dark. If raw greens were considered emotionally destabilizing, then their toppings, the sauces to your sins, were seen as downright provocative. In many parts of Europe, particularly France and northern Italy, the addition of a dressing to salad wasn't just culinary, it was ritualistic. And while daytime meals allowed for bold infusions, garlic macerated in oil, peppercorns, wine vinegars, once the sun dipped below the horizon, the entire philosophy of flavor changed. You were no longer seasoning food. You were attempting to manage the body's humors, soothe the organs, and coax the gut into compliance. Let's start with vinegar. Ah, yes, the great divider. To some Enlightenment thinkers, it was a marvel, cleansing, antiseptic, invigorating. To others, a late-night poison, cold, sharp, acutely troubling to the gall. That's a real quote from an English physician in 1768, whose personal journal contains the phrase, "Supper turned restless due to an excess of cider vinegar." Historians still argue whether vinegar was truly blamed for indigestion, or if it just had the misfortune of being associated with the lower classes, who often relied on it to preserve and flavor otherwise dull food. Either way, at night, its use was discouraged, especially in women. A medical almanac from Prague warned that tart infusions in the late hour may inflame the feminine spleen, whatever that meant. Then there was oil, a slipperier character in every sense. Olive oil was acceptable in warm regions, used modestly in the evening if balanced with the right herbs. But in colder climates, people viewed oil as heavy, sluggish, even emotionally dulling. There was a notion that too much oil would dampen the spark of evening conversation. You picture it, a nobleman yawning at the supper table, blamed not for boredom or fatigue, but for too generous a drizzle of walnut oil on his arugula. Scandalous. In England, there was a particularly odd fear surrounding sour oil, or oil that had sat too long and acquired a tang. This was believed to leach sorrow into the marrow, which is such a gorgeously Gothic phrase that you almost wish it were true. Almost. One pamphlet even suggested oil could harbor sleeping poisons if left exposed to moonlight. Yes, moonlight, as if the salad dressing had a secret pact with lunar forces. Mustard, meanwhile, walked a dangerous line. It was warming, which some late-night diners appreciated, especially in cooler months. But it was also exciting, too exciting. In Parisian salons, mustard was associated with talkative dispositions and ungoverned speech. In other words, it made people gossipy, or worse, honest. Naturally, this made mustard highly unadvisable for late-night political dinners or awkward family gatherings. You wouldn't want Cousin Henry suddenly confessing he's in love with the stable boy all because of a mustard-seeded vinaigrette. There was even a small scandal in Vienna in 1774 involving a minor noblewoman who hosted a nighttime supper with a mustard-heavy dressing. Guests reported unusually vivid dreams, and one man claimed he awoke certain he had argued with his dog in Latin. We are unfortunately missing a follow-up. Now, honey-based dressings had their own issues. Sweetness at night was indulgent, yes, but also dangerous. Many believe sugar clouded the senses after dusk, slowing the pulse and encouraging slothful dreaming. You didn't just risk nightmares, you risked becoming emotionally lazy. This led to an entire generation of anxious cooks tiptoeing through the dressing process. Recipes were whispered, not written. Timing was everything. You could mix a little lemon in the early evening, perhaps, but only if the moon was not yet visible. Too many acid-forward ingredients, expect a night full of humid thoughts. Again, no one knew exactly what that meant, but it was generally considered undesirable.
Interestingly, this dressing-related panic extended to social customs. Offering someone a salad with a particularly bold vinaigrette late in the evening could be read as a kind of challenge, a social dare. Here, try this if you dare to dream vividly tonight. And some people took pride in it. Certain dinner hosts developed reputations for scandalous dressings. A baroness in Bologna was known for her midnight mint oil concoction, which guests whispered about for days afterwards. "It made my jaw tingle," one diplomat reportedly said. "I couldn't stop thinking about the Holy Roman Empire." We are unfortunately missing a follow-up. Now, the dressing wasn't just flavor, it was intention. It signaled how far you were willing to push your guests' bodies and minds in the vulnerable hours of post-dusk. And that brings us to temperature. Oh yes, cold dressings were considered the most alarming. Chilled oils and vinegars were said to slam the gut shut and quicken bile. One particularly dramatic guidebook described cold vinaigrette as a thief in the dark, unfastening the latch of intestinal order. So many rules, so many delicate balances, and so much completely unverified panic. But that's what made it real to them. You feel the logic, strange as it is. Night is vulnerability, sleep is surrender, and anything entering the body in those hours has access to something deeper than digestion. So they treated their meals with suspicion, as if the food itself might crawl into their dreams and whisper forbidden things. Tonight, we do the same, though perhaps with less vinegar. And tomorrow, we continue our descent into evening edibility with a new frontier. Fruit, the seductive wild card. Soft, juicy, fragrant, and historically accused of everything from romantic excess to full-blown madness. Prepare yourself. The peach has plans.
Section 6. You feel it before you see it, the subtle perfume of ripeness in the air. A bowl of glistening fruit sits on the credenza, glowing gently in the candlelight. Peaches, grapes, figs, the seductive trio. To your 18th century European sensibilities, this isn't just dessert. This is temptation on a silver platter. Because fruit, dear listener, was no innocent bedtime snack. By now, you've come to expect the hysteria, but with fruit, the fear took on a dreamlike, almost erotic quality. Unlike greens, which chilled the blood, or roots, which weighed the soul, fruit was seen as emotionally provocative, the edible equivalent of reading poetry in the bath. Dangerous, especially at night. You've probably heard that apples got Eve into trouble. But in the 1700s, it wasn't just Eden's apple under scrutiny. It was all fruit, particularly when it was soft, fragrant, and in season. The concern wasn't just physical digestion, it was moral digestion. What would a nectarine do to your psyche once the sun had gone down? Let's begin with peaches. Oh, peaches. Universally adored, but at night, highly suspect. Their tender flesh and heady aroma were considered aphrodisiacs, particularly in women. One French doctor, clearly in a state of overwrought restraint, described the peach as a fleshy globe of heat and sorrow. His advice? Never when the moon is visible. Historians still argue whether this was metaphor or if he was just very uncomfortable with feelings. There were reports of young ladies fainting at opera houses after indulging in too many slices of cold peach compote. Did the fruit cause the spell? Or was it the corset, heat, and overwhelming boredom? No one dared to say. But the idea stuck. Fruit was decadent, and in some circles, even scandalous. One English sermon from 1782 warned that eating heated fruits at night opens the chest to night demons and unwholesome dreams. Grapes were no better. Though associated with the divine, especially in wine form, raw grapes were considered moisture bombs, small vessels of juicy unpredictability. The idea was that they rushed the system, flooding it with sugar and water, quickening the heart and softening the mind.
One Italian household manual advised that grapes were only suitable after lunch and before the hour of reflection, which sounds like a very specific window of forgiveness. After sunset, you risked something called intestinal chatter. And then there were figs. Figs were treated like romantic ladders you weren't supposed to read. Their interior, rich, dark, seedy, was described in one poetic pamphlet as flesh wrapped in secrets. Eating one at night was thought to stir the undercurrents of desire, particularly in monks, which is a curiously specific demographic to target. In monastic kitchens, figs were frequently banned from dinner, even dried ones. Why? Because they culled up visions. Visionary or not, figs were just the beginning. Stone fruits, such as cherries and plums, were often grouped under the banner of unsettling sweetness. A German folk belief held that too many cherries after supper would make a person laugh in sleep and cry at dawn, which honestly just sounds like modern dating. Then came the most peculiar fear of all, the wet pillow syndrome. This wasn't an actual illness, but rather a term used in Dutch and Belgian texts to describe night sweats or vivid dreams following fruit-heavy suppers. The cause? Allegedly, the fruit's watery spirits escaped through the skin. Of course, there's no science in that, but it was believed with all the authority of whispered tradition and poorly translated Hellenic texts. One Dutch mother wrote in a letter to her daughter, "Do not eat strawberries after sunset, or your head will swell with ghost thoughts." Ghost Thoughts, an excellent band name, and also apparently a hazard of ripe berries. Even fruit peels weren't safe. Lemon zest was morning, yes, but taken late, a tickler of the chest, prone to inspiring midnight wheezes. And apple skins were thought to harden dreams into unpleasant forms, dreams you remember too clearly in the morning. Still, some fruits were cautiously permitted. Apples, especially when baked, were seen as soothing. Softened in the oven and sprinkled with cinnamon, the apple shed its raw dangers and became a gentle sedative. Think of it like the chamomile tea of fruit. In fact, many fruit dish recipes were designed specifically to temper the mood. Pears poached in red wine, prunes stewed with cloves. These were evening fruits, softened by heat and grounded by spices. The idea wasn't to eliminate fruit altogether, but to tame it, transform its essence into something sleep-safe. But raw fruit, uncooked, unadulterated, bursting with juice and primal sweetness, that was too much, too alive, too potent, like letting a thunderstorm into your stomach. And there were, let's be gentle here, some texts warned that eating certain fruits at night roused the lower winds. Yes, that again, you'd think this society was powered by flatulence. Maybe it was. More curious were accounts of dream phenomenon. In parts of Spain, it was said that eating overripe bananas at night would cause dreams of flooding or travel by sea. Whether this was coincidence or the psychological effects of potassium on a weary brain, we may never know. Historians still argue whether such tales were spread to manage rationing or uphold social decorum. After all, fruit was a luxury. Telling people not to eat it at night may have been a convenient way of keeping scarcity under control. But the myth endured. So the next time you eye that midnight fruit bowl, remember, you're not just snacking. You're making a decision with deep historical baggage. Tomorrow, we move from the soft and juicy to the firm and fibrous, cabbages, beans, and night-bloating legumes. Yes, friend, the winds return.
Section 7. You settle deeper into your feather-stuffed settee, perhaps regretting the phantom peaches of our last chapter. But tonight, your digestive fate lies not in the softness of fruit, but in the fibrous force of legumes and crucifers. Beans, cabbage, lentils. The whispering assassins of the nighttime gut. If fruit was provocative, legumes were mechanical, dangerous in a different, more structural way. And cabbage? Well, cabbage was considered, in some circles, a late-night existential crisis wrapped in leaves. Let's begin with the humble bean, a food so vilified after sunset that some Italian boarding schools forbade its presence in the evening altogether. Why? You already know the answer. Air, fermentation, movement, the dreaded night wind. But it wasn't just about embarrassment. That would be too easy. In 18th century medical logic, beans boiled the bile and agitated the soul. One physician in Vienna warned that beans taken after sundown disrupted the temperaments and led to spiritual turbulence. Spiritual turbulence from chickpeas? Historians still argue whether these warnings were rooted in actual discomfort or simply a reflection of how much more dramatic people were willing to be when indigestion was involved. Either way, the warnings were clear. If you must eat legumes, eat them early, chew them well, and pray. In France, lentils had a particularly curious reputation. While they were often served to the sick, soft, digestible, fortifying, they were considered morally questionable at night. A French pamphlet from 1761 warned, "The linseed after dusk awakens memories best left buried." Was this a metaphor? A poetic lament? A dietary threat? Yes. In monasteries, monks were known to avoid beans before compline, the final prayers of the day. It wasn't just about noise, it was about mind space. The gassy haze was said to cloud the spirit's ascent during nighttime contemplation. One especially vivid warning reads, "Let not the brother greet the Lord in prayer with a trembling belly." And then, cabbage. Few foods lived such a double life. Revered as a humble miracle, especially in Eastern Europe, cabbage was praised for its long shelf life, healing properties, and general availability. But when darkness fell, it became something else entirely. A bloated trickster. Raw cabbage was cold. Cold was bad. Boiled cabbage was suspiciously soft. Soft was also bad. Pickled? Now you're adding acidity to the mix. An insult to the internal balance. One German digestive manual warned that cabbage becomes argumentative within the body. What a phrase. Not harmful, just uncooperative. And it wasn't just digestion people worried about. It was dreams. Cabbage was said to bring on verbose nightmares. Dreams in which the dreamer talks endlessly to no one in particular. The medical term? There wasn't one. But the Bavarian translation loosely translates to leaf-headed talk sleep. There's a folk story from Hungary about a man who ate cabbage soup too late in the evening and dreamed he was a goose. Upon waking, he refused to wear boots, declaring himself migratory. It took 3 days to convince him otherwise. Now, not all leguminous or leafy characters were feared equally. Peas, for instance, were considered fairly innocent, at least when mashed. Smooth textures were easier on the belly, and mashing showed intention. It meant you weren't reckless with your legumes. You respected your bedtime. But chickpeas, especially roasted, were accused of stirring the liver's whisper. That sounds poetic, but in practice, it meant digestive agitation and 2 warm dreams. You'd sleep, but you'd toss. And no one wants to wake up at 3 a.m. mid-dream arguing with Voltaire about the ethics of lentil soup. One English housekeeper's manual, delightfully titled The Moral Spoon, advised that evening legume stews should be accompanied by either mint tea or silent reflection, ideally by firelight. The goal wasn't to eliminate beans entirely, it was to acknowledge their power and mitigate the metaphysical fallout. Legumes were also political. Revolutionary thinkers were associated with bean-heavy diets, cheap, protein-rich, populist. So in some aristocratic circles, offering lentils that night was considered gauche or worse, subversive.
a culinary threat to the social order. And cabbage, too, had a class problem. It was associated with peasants, with long winters, with enduring things. To dine on cabbage at night was the signal that you were either economically strained or philosophically tragic. Possibly both. And yet, many people did, because cabbage was everywhere. It was durable, it was abundant, it filled the pot, the belly, the pantry shelf. Night or not, you couldn't avoid it. So the solution became one of preparation and pacing. Boil it long, season it soft, and always pair it with something grounding. Rye bread, a root vegetable, something to anchor the air. And this leads us to the curious practice of sleep vegetables. You heard that right. In some circles, food was divided not into breakfast, lunch, dinner categories, but into wake and sleep categories. Parsnips were a sleep vegetable. Turnips? Questionable. Beans? Never. Cabbage? Only if shredded fine and salted to submission. Even within legumes, there was a hierarchy. Fava beans were considered arrogant. They swelled without warning. Black beans? Mournful, possibly due to their color. Mung beans? Untrustworthy. Lentils? Occasionally acceptable if purified with celestial spices, meaning anise, clove, and sometimes cinnamon. By now, you're noticing the pattern. It wasn't about logic. It was about symbolism. Texture, color, scent, all of it formed part of a food's nighttime identity. If a food whispered too loudly, it was banished from the supper table. You choose slowly, considering your own digestive shadows. Tomorrow, we'll explore an even stranger frontier, the fear of milk. Yes, milk, that most tender, calming, innocuous of beverages. Or so you thought. Get ready for phlegm, melancholy, and the terrifying fate of moon-curdled minds.
Section 8. You're nestled now, fully braced for the next round of culinary terror. And, as promised, it's milk. Sweet, white, calming. Until the 18th century decided it wasn't. Because behind the gentle froth of your imagined bedtime cup lies one of the most bizarrely mistrusted fluids of the European past. Now let's start with the obvious. Milk has long been seen as nurturing. It's the first food, the mother's gift, the emblem of softness itself. But leave it to early modern Europeans to take something innocent and turn it into a phantasm of mucus and lunar interference. That's right, milk at night? According to popular belief, you weren't just drinking a fluid, you were inviting in a host of humoral chaos. Let's break it down. Under the Galenic system, still in fashion across much of the 1700s, milk was considered a phlegmatic food, cold and wet in temperament. Taken in the morning, it might coat the stomach, slow the bile, and gently prepare one for a quiet day. But after sunset, oh no, now you're letting that coldness settle like dew on the soul. Doctors warned that milk consumed late in the evening could curdle the spirits, making thoughts sluggish and dreams thick. It was said to blanch the brain, which sounds poetic until you realize it meant making your inner world foggy and confused. No one wants foggy inner worlds when trying to fall asleep under 10 pounds of linen and existentials red. One medical tract from Edinburgh, dated 1743, explicitly advises against milk consumption after 7 p.m. Why? Because it could lead to moon bloating, a vague syndrome marked by facial puffiness, melancholy, and moist dreams of pale beasts. What exactly are pale beasts? No one ever clarifies, but you don't want them in your dreams.
Historians still argue whether this moon bloating was based on lactose intolerance, random dairy-based misfortunes, or pure poetic superstition. Possibly all three. Of course, it wasn't just the milk itself, it was what happened to it when you heated it. Warm milk seems like the ultimate bedtime cliché now. But in 18th century kitchens, warming milk wasn't always seen as a soothing act. It was a ritual of risk. You had to be careful with the temperature. Too cool, and it was useless, still raw in humoral terms. Too hot, and you risked boiling the virtue out. One French housewife's diary describes her husband's evening collapse after drinking improperly scalded milk. She wrote, "He took to bed with shivers and spoke only of swans." Another concern was milk mixed with sugar, a common evening tonic. But sugar, of course, was considered heating, while milk was cooling, and the result was a dietary paradox. One English pamphlet warned that the harmony of opposites might flatter the tongue, but it breeds a civil war in the belly. Yes, civil war inside you, caused by milk tea. And then there's the cultural class dimension. Aristocrats often preferred their dairy in the form of cream, ideally spooned delicately from porcelain dishes. Peasants, on the other hand, drank milk straight from the bucket or the pot. The upper class found this rustic consumption suspect, too wild, too raw, as if unfiltered dairy carried with it a trace of barnyard rebellion. In Poland and parts of Hungary, bedtime milk was considered dangerous for emotional reasons. Milk, as a food that came from the body, was believed to pull upon the heart. Drinking it at night was said to invite sentimental dreams, especially among widows. You might fall asleep just fine, but wake sobbing, confused, and emotionally damp. Some texts even link nighttime milk to melancholia, that ever-present 18th century buzzword for a whole grab bag of depressive symptoms. In this case, the belief was that milk's cool, slow properties drew down the spirits, making it hard to wake the next day with a clear mind. There's also the horror of spoiled milk. With no refrigeration, milk could turn quickly, and night milk, stored all day, was inherently suspect. No wonder it earned a reputation as a fluid of betrayal. In one Dutch folk rhyme, "The milk of the morning feeds the calf, but night milk is for the witch's draught." Charming. Then there's cheese. You might think cheese would be worse, being a condensed version of all things dairy. And yes, aged cheese, especially strong varieties like blue or goat, was considered a provocateur of odd dreams. But soft cheeses, like fresh curds, were oddly, tolerated. So long as they were eaten with bread. Bread, you see, was the great harmonizer. A slice of dense, crusty bread could neutralize almost anything, in theory, including rogue dairy. Hence the popular pairing of bread and milk as a safe supper in many households, even if some still whispered warnings. But things got really interesting with milk and sleepwalking. That's right, milk was sometimes blamed for nocturnal wandering. A pamphlet printed in 1778 in northern Italy linked bedtime dairy consumption to midnight dissociations, where the sleeper might rise, walk, speak nonsense, or stare blankly at corners for extended periods. You begin to wonder how anyone in the 1700s dared to eat anything after sunset. Some people got creative. To avoid milk's supposed dangers, but still benefit from its comfort, enterprising cooks invented milk substitutes, almond milk, oat infusions, even warm wine frothed with egg whites. These drinks mimicked the mouthfeel of milk without risking what one British essayist called the white sadness. And then, of course, there were those who drank it anyway. Rules were always bendable when flavor and comfort were involved. One German noblewoman, known for her nighttime milk indulgence, reportedly told guests, "If this be the devil's brew, then let me dream in his garden." Not everyone was ready to die on the anti-dairy hill. Still, the stigma lingered. Children were most often the victims, given warm milk to soothe their nerves, only to wake up confused, wet, and dream-laden. The milk was blamed. Not the thunderstorm, not the poor insulation, definitely not the emotional repression, just the milk. So tonight, if you find yourself warming a mug of something white and creamy, ask yourself, are you comforting your modern soul or summoning the pale beasts of a distant dairy-terrified age? Next we turn to a grain once considered noble, then cursed, then redemptive. Bread. Yes, even bread. It wasn't always safe, and sometimes it fought back.
Section 9. By now, you're probably convinced that the 18th century was a dangerous time to be hungry after dinner. But if one food might have offered you solace, a symbol of stability in the shifting winds of humoral suspicion, it was bread. Familiar, warm, sturdy. A food you could tear with your hands and soak in soups. A comfort, a friend. Except, yes, of course, bread too had its secrets. Because even this ancient staple, this golden crust of civilization, had a night form. And it wasn't always gentle. Let's begin with the good news. In most of Europe, bread was the bedrock of supper, especially in households that couldn't afford meat or fine confections. It was the grounding food, said to soak up stray humors and calm the belly. A crust before bed was considered a kind of digestive sponge, soaking up errant dampness. If you had no bread, you had no protection. This is why bread was often the last thing touched before lights out. A crust tucked in with warm milk, a torn heel served with broth. It's also why, in some regions, crumbs left on the table overnight were swept with prayer, not just a rag. They were sacred scraps. But things became complicated depending on the type of bread. White bread, made with refined wheat flour, was soft, elegant, and, by 18th century standards, spiritually dull. It was thought to lack moral fiber, both literally and figuratively. Popular among the rich, it was blamed for weak stomachs and absent dreams. A French apothecary wrote, "He who eats white loaves must keep strong thoughts beside him, lest his sleep vanish into vapor." Meanwhile, brown bread, coarse, rugged, flecked with rye or barley, was praised for its fortifying nature. But this too could turn if eaten too late. Dense breads were believed to linger in the gut like winter fog, especially if underbaked or heavy with crust. Nocturnal baking, therefore, was discouraged unless you were willing to eat the evidence at sunrise. And then came the crust paranoia. One particularly strange belief held that eating crusts before bed made you more susceptible to lying in dreams, as in you'd fabricate stories within your sleep. A curious German folk remedy warned parents not to let children fall asleep with a dry mouthful of crust, lest they dream of untruth and wake in confusion. Historians still argue whether this belief stems from symbolic interpretations of crust, as the hardened exterior masking a soft core, or whether it was just a creative way to make kids finish their soft middles first. There was also debate about the proper method of eating bread before bed. Tearing it by hand was considered humble and digestible. Cutting it with a knife? A bit aggressive. Toasting it? Potentially dangerous. The toasting process introduced elemental fire, which some believed made the bread too warming for evening consumption. One tract from 1739 claims the toasted edge, crisped by flame, carries the imprint of Mars and thus excites the blood. In other words, your croutons might lead to nighttime restlessness. A pity. But the most contested part of bread's reputation, stale bread. Stale bread was ubiquitous. It had to be. Without preservatives, loaves hardened quickly, and most families couldn't afford to discard old slices. Instead, they were soaked in milk, stewed with broth, or sliced into puddings. But in some quarters, stale bread was believed to store memories, old emotions, past arguments, residue from meals long gone. Eating it at night, therefore, was said to invite echoes, emotional repetition. You might dream the same dream 2 nights in a row, or recall a grudge you'd buried. Or worse, wake up with a strange craving for a conversation that never actually happened. One pamphlet titled On the Evils of Reheated Dough warned, "To sleep on yesterday's bread is to dream of yesterday's bitterness." The author, apparently a man scorned by both baker and lover, made no attempt to mask his grievances. In France, leftover baguette was often grated into soup for supper. But even here, warnings persisted. One old Parisian rhyme went, "The bread that saw the dawn will whisper while you yawn, and bring you dreams of days undone, until your night is gone." Cheerful, right? Still, bread retained a mystical halo. In some rural villages, loaves were blessed before being set out for the next day. Not to preserve them, but to ensure they wouldn't absorb night spirits. This is how deep the fear ran. Even inanimate flour products weren't trusted after dark. The most superstitious households never baked bread on Thursdays. Why? Because it was believed that Thursday loaves soured faster, and thus, if eaten on Thursday night, might turn the mood in the body before Friday's prayers. This somehow made complete sense to people navigating an era where digestion was treated with bloodletting and cabbage poultices. Bread was also tied to the rhythm of grains and the moon. It was said that bread baked on the new moon was light, while bread baked during the waning moon was dense and sleepy. Some housewives even kept lunar bread journals. One such record reads, "Loaf of rye, rising well, baked under a waxing moon, children calm, sleep long, no dreams reported." Was this science? No. Was it evidence-based? Of course not. Was it compelling? Deeply. You begin to see a pattern here, one of contradiction and metaphor, of caution masquerading as wisdom. Bread at night could be safe, or it could be dream fuel, or liar's yeast, or memory bait. It all depended on its crust, its temperature, and the moon. But if bread raised questions, the next course, meat, raised an entire parliament of doubt. Coming up, sinews, sins, and why eating lamb after dusk was like feeding your soul to the wolves.
Section 10. By now, you've learned to fear salad, distrust milk, and question even your bread. But nothing stirred midnight anxiety in the 18th century European household quite like meat. Ah yes, meat. The proud centerpiece of many feasts, the protein of power, the thing that once meant survival. And yet, when the sun dipped below the horizon, meat transformed from a hearty staple into something decidedly more sinister. Let's ease into it. In the daylight hours, meat was celebratory. A roast at noon meant abundance. A stew in the early afternoon showed prosperity. But after sundown, that same roast could be considered a risk to the soul, or at least to your digestion. Start with the obvious. Meat was hot, not just in temperature, but in its humoral alignment. Galenic medicine declared meat to be warming and drying, which sounds okay until you realize that nighttime, by contrast, was cold and moist. Put the two together and you were supposedly begging for imbalance. You were throwing a bonfire into a fog bank, or worse, into your stomach. Doctors wrote stern warnings in dusty treatises. Let no man eat lamb after vespers bell, lest the heart be pricked with sulphurous dreams. There's no clinical backing for this claim, of course, unless you count night terrors induced by indigestion and centuries of guilt. Certain meats were worse than others. Beef, for example, was heavy, noble, and slow to digest. Eating it late could, as one physician claimed, anchor the thoughts to the body
and caused dreams that felt like sinking. Sleepers who consumed beef at night often reported feelings of being chased or trapped. The consensus? Too much cow and you'd find yourself dreaming from within a muddy field. Then there was lamb, long associated with innocence and softness, until it became tangled in post-sunset paranoia. Lamb was feared for its spiritual weight. It wasn't just meat, it was sacrificial meat. To eat it after dark, according to some clergymen, was to feast upon twilight itself. What does that mean? No one knew, but people nodded solemnly and passed the lentils instead. Pork was a different beast, literally and metaphorically. Often associated with gluttony and carnal temptation, pork was believed to stimulate impure thoughts if consumed too late. An Italian monastery once banned all pork dishes after the evening bell, citing a rise in nocturnal emissions and unruly dreams. Coincidence? Maybe. Effective PR campaign? Certainly. Game meats, venison, pheasant, boar, were deeply contested. On one hand, they were prized among the aristocracy. On the other, they carried a wildness, a residue of the forest. Hunters often claimed that eating such meat at night invited the animal spirit into your sleep, which could lead to restless legs, primal nightmares, or waking up in the garden covered in dirt and owl feathers. Okay, maybe not owl feathers, but you get the point. Historians still argue whether these fears had practical roots, like a higher chance of spoilage or illness, or if it was just another layer of post-sunset dietary suspicion. Either way, if you were gnawing on cold mutton in bed at midnight, you were courting spiritual disaster and probably a stomachache. And the way meat was cooked mattered. Roasted meat, charred and crisp, was considered more violent in nature, retaining the fire of its preparation. Stewed meat, on the other hand, was thought to be calmer, softened by water, and therefore marginally safer after dark. But even stew could betray you, especially if it included onions, too stimulating, wine, invites dreamy pride, or garlic, believed to wake the blood. A German folk remedy advised those who had to eat meat at night to chew fennel seeds afterward to cool the humors and prevent visions of hunger beasts. Yes, hunger beasts. You know, the kind that visit in dreams, cloven-footed and whispering about leftover sausages. You might think vegetarians had it easier, but no, nighttime meat abstinence didn't spare you from scrutiny. People who regularly refused meat in the evening were sometimes viewed as spiritually evasive, as if denying meat was a way of denying the day's moral weight. In fact, in some English households, failing to eat the meat served at dinner, even just picking around the bones, was thought to bring on faintness, and not just physical, moral faintness. You were a suspiciously light sleeper. You might have secrets. And if you think meat phobia stopped at supper, consider this. One London apothecary warned his patients never to dream of meat. That's right, dreaming of it was cause for concern. It meant your stomach hadn't finished its work, and the phantoms of digestion were now roaming your subconscious. He even included a helpful chart. Roast duck equaled self-deception. Ham equals jealousy. Sausages equaled regret. The human mind truly knows no limits when left unsupervised near a kitchen and too much candlelight. There were regional superstitions too. In Spain, a nighttime serving of chorizo was thought to inflame the tongue, not metaphorically, but actually. Your mouth may burn, said one pamphlet, and your words come sharp as blades. Some took this literally, others as a warning against late-night arguments over tapas. Meanwhile, in rural Sweden, a superstition held that if you spoke while eating meat after dark, you might utter the name of the dead and summon a visit in your dreams. People reportedly took vows of silence through whole evening meals. Picture it. A whole family eating rabbit stew in tense, quiet dread. Even leftover meat was suspect. It carried the weight of its original meal, and if reheated improperly, might trigger an echo of the first hunger. A poetic way of saying indigestion, sure, but some genuinely believed that cold cuts could cause déjà vu. So what did people eat instead at night? Grains, gruels, soups made with legumes or roots, simple eggs, soft-boiled, never fried, and occasionally the ever-controversial salad, which, as you remember, sparked this whole bedtime horror in the first place. Coming next, dessert. Sweet, delicate, and filled with dangerous temptations, because the 18th century didn't trust sugar any more than it trusted sunlight.
Section 11. So here we are. You've managed to sidestep the treacherous terrain of salad, milk, bread, and meat. You've politely declined the roast beef and stared suspiciously at your crust. Maybe you've even whispered a prayer over your lentil stew. And now someone offers you a piece of cake. How sweet, how innocent, how laced with suspicion. Because if there was ever a category of food that embodied both indulgence and danger in 18th century Europe, it was dessert, particularly when eaten after dark. Sugar was not merely a treat, it was an agent of transformation, of energy, of mischief. And if consumed carelessly, it was said to turn the mind loose during sleep. Let's begin with sugar itself. In the early 1700s, sugar was still something of a luxury in many European households, though it was becoming more common, thanks in large part to colonial trade. By mid-century, even modest homes might keep a small cone of sugar under lock and key, scraping off a bit for tea, porridge, or, on special nights, a dessert. But sugar wasn't just sweet. It was provocative. Medical texts warned that sugar stirreth the spirits and could lead to a restless mind, particularly if taken without temperance or fasting of the soul. Yes, people were warned to spiritually fast before dessert. Not exactly your modern midnight snack advice. The fear wasn't entirely baseless. People noticed that children who ate candied fruits or sweetmeats before bed often became jittery or talkative, or if they finally did sleep, woke up sweating. The child burns with syrup dreams, one physician wrote. Best to feed him boiled roots instead. Confectionery was particularly scandalous. Jellied fruits, honeyed nuts, sugar-dusted marzipan. These were not just sweet, they were seductive. Some even called them the foods of loose tongues, believing they led to chatter, immodesty, and even scandalous dreams. You could be asleep and still guilty of dessert. Then there was the issue of texture. Chewy sweets were said to delay digestion and linger in the stomach, while crispy, flaky pastries were accused of shattering the night's balance. Historians still argue whether this was poetic digestion theory or a collective European overreaction to baklava. But one thing they agreed on, custards were dangerous. That's right, custard, that smooth, wobbly darling of the dessert table, was viewed with a mix of awe and dread. Its softness made it appealing, but its mixture of milk and eggs placed it right at the intersection of two humoral hazards. A British pamphlet from 1752 warned, "Let not custard cross thy lips after the vesper bell, lest thou sweat of both cow and hen in thy slumber." Catchy, right? In France, the debate over chocolate was especially heated. Once a prized tonic for monks and royalty, chocolate's rise as a dessert drink made it an object of suspicion by the sleep-conscious. Rich and warm, it was said to rouse the nerves and stimulate dreams so vivid that they could blur the line between vision and waking.
A poet even described chocolate dreams as the kind that leave teeth marks in the pillow. Of course, not all sweets were feared equally. Fruit-based desserts, like poached pears or apple tarts, were tolerated, if not exactly encouraged. The reasoning was that fruits, especially if cooked, had been softened by fire and were less likely to inflame the gut. But even these were best eaten early in the evening, preferably followed by a walk, a prayer, and a cup of bitter herbal tea, just to be safe. Candied violets and flower syrups were fashionable in parts of Germany and Austria, but only in moderate amounts. Consuming too many floral sweets was believed to induce light-headed sleep, a dreamy, floaty state where the soul might drift too far from the body and not find its way back. One superstition warned of flower sleepers who never woke up at all. At the same time, desserts were not only feared, they were weaponized. A lover's tart left at the door could carry hidden meaning. Sweetness after dark might imply moral ambiguity. One Scottish family reportedly disowned a daughter for accepting ginger biscuits from a suitor after the stars were visible. Even honey had baggage. Though natural and sacred in some traditions, honey was also tied to dream recall. Eating it before bed was said to make dreams stick to your waking mind like resin. This could be wonderful or harrowing, depending on what your subconscious was up to that week. Still, people didn't stop eating desserts, they just made rules about it. Some customs insisted on neutralizing sweets with specific antidotes. A warm apple tart, drink a spoonful of cider vinegar afterward. Sweet plums, follow with black bread and a muttered charm. In Rome, a digestif made from fennel and anise was believed to guard the blood from the teasing of sugar. A Baroque solution for a Baroque problem. And here's the real twist. While many believed sweets could damage your night, others believed they could reveal truths, especially in dreams. One folk belief claimed that a slice of treacle tart placed beneath the pillow would give the sleeper visions of their future spouse. Another swore that eating candied almonds before sleep would allow you to communicate with the dead, provided you hadn't spoken for the final hour of your day. It's no surprise, then, that some households had entire rituals around dessert. Cakes baked only on Fridays, sugared wine taken only in silence, puddings blessed before cooling, all to avoid the dreaded sweet dreams that left you breathless at dawn. And no discussion of dessert paranoia would be complete without a mention of spice. Cinnamon, nutmeg, cloves, oh yes, these tiny powders had big reputations. Thought to heat the blood and stir emotion, spiced desserts were often blamed for midnight longings. One recipe for mulled cider came with a warning, steep the cloves in wine, but not thy heart in lust. So you sit there, perhaps nibbling on the corner of a biscuit, wondering, was anything safe to eat after dinner? And to that, the 18th century would answer with a tight smile and a nervous glance at the moon, possibly porridge. But before we dive into humble oats, we must address one final indulgence feared above all others, the elusive, mystical, and deeply divisive nightcap. Coming next, wine, beer, elixirs, and why even a drop could drown your dreams.
Section 12. So, you're full now, or as full as one can be on root gruel and a whisper of stewed apple. The table's cleared, the fire's died down, and your host leans in with a final offer. A small something to settle the nerves. A nightcap, that gentle, golden promise. A little wine, a sip of ale, perhaps a dram of brandy, just enough to warm the chest, loosen the mind, soften the edge of consciousness before bed. Except, if you asked an 18th century European, nightcaps weren't just innocent indulgences.
They were often viewed as drowsy sorcery, a cocktail of temptation, danger, and, if poorly timed, spiritual compromise. Let's uncork that. In the early 1700s, alcohol was widely consumed. Even children were given weak beer or watered-down wine because water itself couldn't always be trusted. But drinking before bed, that was a separate issue entirely. Wine, especially red wine, was considered warming, too warming. If consumed at night, it was said to ignite the thoughts, encouraging not just vivid dreams, but restless ambition. The sort of dream that made you wake up convinced you'd invented a flying harpsichord, or should challenge your landlord to a duel. Doctors warned against drinking wine after the sunset, especially without food. "Let not wine enter the fasting vessel," wrote one London apothecary in 1739, "for it will find only the soul, and stir it rudely." But not all wine was feared equally. White wine was seen as more delicate and less confrontational, though it was sometimes accused of thinning the dream wall, letting in strange visions or ghostly visitors. One German folk tale tells of a woman who drank a cup of Riesling every night and eventually began receiving visits from her dead sister, who only spoke in riddles about root vegetables. Fortified wines like port or sherry were rich, sweet, and suspicious. They often came with sugar or spice, amplifying the already feared effects of both. "A dram of port after supper," one French cleric wrote, "is like inviting 5 thoughts to your bed, and none will let the others rest." Then there's beer, which held a gentler reputation. Dark ales were considered earthy, and in small amounts, grounding. They were sometimes recommended for nervous sleepers or those plagued by airy thoughts. But beware the hopped varieties. Strong hops were believed to lead to heavy, molasses-like sleep, the kind that left you sluggish, irritable, and unable to remember your dreams. Or worse, able to remember them, all of them. Brandy and spirits, those were the devils in disguise. Brandy was sharp, clean, seductive. A shot before bed might numb the tongue and warm the stomach, but many warned that it hardened the soul for dreaming. Spirits, it was believed, locked the mind in a barrel, trapping your consciousness in a loop of images and half-thoughts, making restful sleep impossible. In France, this led to a short-lived trend called dream fasting, where aristocrats would avoid any strong drink for 3 days in hopes of clearing the mind for more pure sleep visions. Unsurprisingly, this often ended in early relapse and late-night brandy binges. The folk remedies tied to alcohol were even stranger. Some believed you could trap dreams in a bottle. Before sleep, you'd whisper your fears into a small vial of wine, seal it, and drink it only if you wanted to confront those fears. A Scottish superstition warned, "Drink the fear wine thrice and face the shadow man, or spill it, and he comes anyway." In parts of Eastern Europe, herbal liqueurs were popular as pre-bed potions. Made from wormwood, fennel, or angelica root, these tinctures were said to aid digestion, but many claimed they caused prophetic dreams. "Drink, and you may see what tomorrow hides, but beware, it may not wait until morning." Historians still argue whether these dreams were meaningful or merely digestive side effects mixed with storytelling. But the fear remained. Drink too deeply, and you might dream of things better left unknown. Even non-alcoholic tonics weren't safe from suspicion. Warm cider with cloves, or a sweet milk punch laced with nutmeg. Delicious, but also suspect. Too many spices, too much warmth, and suddenly you were waking up at 3 a.m. convinced your cat was a messenger of doom. The worst offender? The mysterious sleep elixirs. These potions were sold by apothecaries and traveling charlatans, promising restful slumber, gentle digestion, and the keeping away of witch dreams. Their ingredients? usually wine mixed with opium, crushed herbs, and sometimes a bit of camphor or ambergris. People slept, sure, but some never really woke up. There's a record of one nobleman in Vienna who drank a nightly elixir that gave him the same dream every night. He wandered a silent forest, endlessly pursued by a bear with his mother's voice. After 2 years of this, he switched to beer. The dream stopped. So did his marriage, but that's another story. You might be wondering, why not just drink water? Well, nighttime water was a topic of its own. Some believed that water drawn after sundown was spiritually vulnerable, open to contamination from moonlight and malice. You could drink it, but it might carry echoes, or, if stored in a metal jug, harbor night voices. One Italian grandmother reportedly whispered, "Excuse me," to her water jug before taking a sip, just in case. There were safe choices, of course. Some people swore by herbal teas, chamomile, mint, or lemon balm, calling them the blanket in a cup. These were widely accepted as sleep-friendly. Still, even these came with rules: always brewed fresh, never reheated, and never, ever shared. Sharing tea before bed was thought to tangle your dreams with the other person's. Romantic in theory, disastrous in practice. So, as you sit there, cup in hand, wondering whether your sleep drink will grant peaceful dreams or a night of hallucinatory moral reckonings, you can take comfort in one thing. Everyone else was just as confused. Next up, it's time to leave the table finally. But don't think the fear ends with food, because now you have to navigate the dark, creaky walk to the bedroom itself, where superstition thrives and dreams await with open claws.
Section 13. You stand up, push your chair back, and step away from the dinner table. Your stomach is cautiously neutral. No rebellious custard, no traitor's mulled wine. You're clean, or at least as clean as someone can be in a century where food was frequently accused of emotional sabotage. But the night isn't done with you. Now comes the walk to your bedroom. Sounds simple, right? Wrong. Because in the 18th century, the walk to bed was not just a stroll down a dim hallway. It was a ritual journey through superstitions, squeaky floorboards, and very questionable lighting. Let's talk about those lights first. Your options are limited. A single candle, maybe two if you're fancy or reckless. Candles were often tallow, rendered animal fat, not beeswax, which was far more expensive and reserved for churches and dead people. Tallow candles sputtered, smoked, and occasionally exploded into flame if you looked at them wrong. But they were all you had. And as you tiptoe down the corridor, that flame becomes your most precious asset and your greatest liability. Drop it, and the house could burn down. Cup it wrong, and the flame gutters, throwing monstrous shadows on the walls. So yes, every bedtime became a scene straight out of amateur Gothic horror. Most folks didn't walk in silence either. You whispered protective charms, just in case. Some muttered prayers, others repeated nonsense rhymes. One German rhyme went, "Light to guide, flame to keep, no dream thief shall steal my sleep." Catchy, and apparently effective, if you didn't stumble into something first. Because the real menace in the nighttime home wasn't just bad dreams, it was architecture. In old manor houses and city flats alike, creaking staircases, warped floorboards, and loose stones were regular hazards. Tripping at night was not only painful, it was spiritually suspicious. Superstitions warned that if you fell on your way to bed, it meant your sleep would be haunted or incomplete. Some even said you'd leave part of your soul behind with the splintered step. To counter this, people carried walking sticks or broom handles, not for support, but to tap each board ahead of them. If it creaked 3 times, step over it. If it creaked only once, safe. If it didn't creak at all, too safe, probably cursed. And then, at last, you reached the bedroom door. But before you even touch the handle, pause.
In many households, bedrooms were spirit-sensitive spaces. You couldn't just march in like a conquering general. Oh no, you had to knock on your own bedroom door. Twice if you lived alone, 3 times if the house was shared, just in case any visiting spirits had taken up temporary residence during the day. Think of it as ghost etiquette. You give them a moment to leave, and they, in turn, don't whisper riddles in your ears while you sleep. Once inside, the air changes. It smells of dust, linen, faint smoke. The warmth of the hearth doesn't quite reach here, and the shadows seem more committed. You set your candle down and glance at the bed, that centerpiece of nighttime hope and dread. Beds in the 18th century were often enormous, not for luxury, because they had to accommodate multiple sleepers, especially in colder months. Families piled in, servants shared beds, travelers bunked together. Entire households sometimes curled in one bed like some historical lasagna of limbs and muffled snores. If you were lucky enough to sleep alone, congratulations. You are now the sole guardian of the room's psychic balance. The bed itself might be curtained with heavy fabric, part privacy, part draft protection, part mystical shield. Curtains were thought to keep dreams in or keep unwanted spirits out. Either way, they were tied shut with ribbons or tucked behind bedposts, forming a little cloth fortress of sleep. And under the bed? Well, no one really knew, because no one looked. You might hide shoes under there, or maybe a forgotten chamber pot, but many people simply refused to glance into that darkness. It wasn't just about monsters. It was the belief that the space beneath the bed was liminal, a threshold between waking and dreaming, where stray thoughts or regrets might accumulate like dust. Some families even swept under the bed before every sleep, muttering, "Nothing walks here but sleep." A bit intense, sure, but probably better than stepping on a dream worm. And now the pre-bed rituals begin. First, the bedclothes. Sheets were tucked, shaken, smoothed, and inspected. Because wrinkles weren't just uncomfortable, they were blamed for drinkled dreams. No joke, one French manual advised, "Smooth thy bedding, lest thy thoughts turn against thee." Then the bed mattress thump. That's right, before lying down, many people literally thumped their mattress with both hands. This was believed to dislodge slumber spirits, or more practically, check for mice. Either way, it was not optional. Next, personal objects placed carefully by the bed. A comb, a Bible, a pouch of lavender. Some placed their shoes toe to toe, facing the door, so dreams would know which way to leave. Others left them sideways to signal, "No visits, please." And if your shoes weren't aligned properly, well, your dreams might get confused and stay too long. You see, dreams were treated almost like guests, unpredictable, but bound by certain rules if you played your cards right. And then came the final step, lying down. You didn't just flop into bed, you lay on your right side first to support the liver, obviously. Left side, too close to the heart, and therefore a risk of emotional dreams. Back sleepers were warned that they might invite open-eye visions, which sounds lovely until you realize it referred to sleep paralysis. People also had firm opinions about which direction the bed should face. Ideally, your head pointed north or east to align with the magnetic pole of health or the rising sun. Beds that pointed south? Risky. West? Downright reckless. No one wanted to align their dreams with the setting sun. Too final. At last, wrapped in layers of linen and hand-me-down quilts, you're ready to close your eyes. But not before the final bedtime utterance. Some mumbled scripture, others whispered family names. A few uttered full-blown incantations like, "Let no shadow cross my chest. Let no wanderer steal my breath. Let my bones lie soft and still, and let my sleep obey my will." All of that just to go to sleep. But you haven't even entered the dream world yet. And the 18th century had strong opinions about what dreams were, where they came from, and what horrors or revelations they might bring. In section 14, we cross into that surreal territory
where dream theory, bedtime warnings, and philosophical debates converge in a fog of embroidered pillows and subconscious melodrama.
Section 14. Your head sinks into the pillow, the world blurs at the edges, and sleep tiptoes into the room like a cautious guest. But even now, in these fragile twilight moments between consciousness and the void, you're not truly alone. Because in the 18th century, falling asleep wasn't seen as a simple biological necessity. It was viewed as a spiritual voyage, a crossing into a realm where dreams didn't just entertain or confuse, they warned, revealed, and sometimes condemned. To slumber was to submit. And to dream, that was to risk exposure to the self, the divine, or something darker. You close your eyes, and according to the most popular belief systems of the time, your soul begins to rise. Dream theory in this era was a mixed bag of folk beliefs, half-remembered Greek philosophy, Christian mysticism, and one or two slightly inebriated herbalists with vivid imaginations. Some believed that during sleep, the soul left the body entirely, wandering through the heavens, libraries of the dead, or just the neighbor's barn. Others believed dreams were the language of angels, whispered into your unconscious mind for decoding the next morning over weak tea and dry toast. But whatever the origin, dreams were rarely seen as meaningless. Let's start with the religious perspective, since this was still a deeply Christian continent. Dreaming was treated with an uneasy reverence. The Bible was full of dreamers: Joseph, Daniel, the Magi. Dreams could foretell futures, carry divine instruction, or serve as moral tests. This made interpreting them a matter of not just curiosity, but salvation. So, naturally, people started keeping dream journals. Yes, long before bullet journaling and ASMR sleep tracking apps, there were worn little notebooks hidden under pillows, filled with cramped handwriting and cryptic entries like "horse with two faces equals beware Thomas," or "teeth fell out again, must avoid meat." These journals were often consulted by priests or local dream readers, semi-respected figures who straddled the line between holy wisdom and vaguely tolerated witchcraft. If your dream included fire, they'd ask what color. If you dreamt of water, they'd want to know how deep. Dream of your dead uncle handing you a chicken? That's clearly about inheritance or indigestion, depending on the phase of the moon. Historians still argue whether these interpretations held any consistent logic or were just desperate pattern matching. But what's undeniable is that people took them very, very seriously. Then there was the scientific dream camp, a growing school of Enlightenment thinkers who, quite reasonably, suggested that dreams might be products of digestion, muscle memory, or an overactive imagination. You dream of wolves because your room is cold and your feet are exposed, said one particularly nonsense Dutch physician. Still, even among skeptics, there was an understanding that dreams could be revealing, just not because of angels or omens. One French philosopher argued that dreams showed the shape of the self without clothing. A slightly unsettling phrase, yes, but also a precursor to modern psychology, minus Freud's cigar obsession. Now, let's not forget the folk traditions, especially the rural beliefs that clung tightly to ideas passed down in kitchen whispers and alleyway murmurs. In some parts of Eastern Europe, dreams were believed to be communal. That is, a person could accidentally share their dream with someone nearby. If two people slept in the same room and both dreamt of water, it was considered a sign that their souls had met and waded together. This was sometimes viewed as romantic, sometimes suspicious, and occasionally the start of a minor village scandal. There was also the notion of mirror dreams, a belief that someone, somewhere, was dreaming the opposite of what you were dreaming. If you dreamt of great joy, someone else was suffering,
If you dreamt of death, someone else was being born. Dreamers were seen as part of a delicate balance, the night's ecosystem. Perhaps the most unsettling fringe belief was that dreams could be stolen. Yes, stolen. You see, certain witches, or simply bitter neighbors with access to lavender and bad intentions, were believed to be able to extract someone's dream, either through a whispered chant or by sleeping with an item of theirs under their pillow. The result? The victim slept deeply, but without dreams, while the thief enjoyed vivid, possibly prophetic visions. People began guarding their pillowcases. A Parisian baker reported sleeping with a lock of his own hair under his tongue to anchor the dreams in place. He also developed halitosis and died alone. But again, that's another story. Now, let's revisit the dream symbols that most 18th century sleepers feared. Falling teeth, loss of wealth or status, floods or rising water, emotional unrest or impending scandal, birds in the house, death, nakedness in public, exposure of secrets, or on a better day, upcoming marriage, fire, passion, change, or divine wrath, depending on your bedtime snack, traveling alone, loss of direction in life, or soul separation risk, seeing a mirror, risk of seeing not yourself, but the you who died in a different dream. Spooky. And then there were the prophetic dreams, those rare, often terrifying visions that seemed to come true. One famous case involved a tailor's apprentice in Prague who dreamt that the city would flood. He awoke, panicked, and ran door to door, warning people. Most laughed. Then it rained for 6 days straight, and the river rose beyond its banks. He was later asked to work for the mayor. He declined and opened a pie shop instead. The other side of dream culture was dream suppression. Yes, people actively tried to prevent dreams from happening. Why? Because many feared what they'd see. Guilt, divine judgment, or worse, themselves in a better life. Some swallowed poppy syrup. Others bound their temples in cloth to keep the mind still. One infamous London doctor recommended eating 2 boiled turnips with salt before bed to root the soul to the body. Did it work? Possibly. Did it taste good? Almost certainly not. Of course, for every rule, there was an exception. Lovers often sought out shared dreams. They'd wear matching ribbons or lie with their hands entwined, hoping to meet each other in the dreamscape. Sometimes they did. Sometimes one of them ended up riding a bear through a burning orchard while the other dreamt of nothing but cabbage. You can't win them all. As your breathing slows and your dream begins to take shape, perhaps you're floating or maybe lost in a foggy ballroom filled with whispering clocks, you might wonder if it means anything. Is your mind revealing a secret truth? Are you reliving some ancient memory? Or is it just your brain doing a weird little puppet show while the rest of you recharges? The answer is yes, because in the 18th century, dreams weren't just dreams. They were stories you didn't write, but somehow still owned. And tomorrow when you wake up and try to remember what happened, what really happened, just know that it was probably your shoe's fault. In section 15, we rise with the morning sun and explore the final piece of the puzzle, the dangerous art of breakfast, where food, fear, and fragile digestion meet again with a little ghost story to stir your porridge.
Section 15. You stir. Light presses gently through the thin curtains, painting the wooden floor with a milky yellow haze. A rooster calls somewhere in the distance, unless, of course, you're in London, in which case it's probably just a fruit seller yelling at pigeons. Either way, the night is over. Or is it? Because waking up in the 18th century isn't just a matter of stretching, yawning, and doom-scrolling.
It's an event, especially when your first waking act could determine the mood of your entire day. And that brings us, rather cautiously, to breakfast. You might assume that after a long night of avoiding death by salad, choking on ghosts or dreams, and not accidentally summoning your grandmother with a poorly folded pillowcase, breakfast would be a source of comfort. Ha! Breakfast in this century was less about pancakes and more about survival by digestion. Let's start with the basics. What did people actually eat? Well, if you were a rural farmer or laborer, breakfast meant something hearty and grim. Porridge, maybe with a bit of stale bread soaked in ale, and if you were truly blessed by the breakfast deities, a slice of cold meat from last night's supper. For city dwellers, it could be bread with butter or cheese, sometimes stewed fruit, and always a debate about whether to eat immediately upon waking or wait until your body settled. Doctors in the 18th century loved nothing more than telling you not to do things your body told you to. Waking up hungry, that's your liver lying to you. One physician in Bath swore that no food should pass your lips until 3 good thoughts and 1 bowel movement had occurred. Poetic, impractical, very on brand for the time. Now, if you were wealthy, things got interesting. Rich households believed strongly in the breakfast window, a short, allegedly ideal period after waking when digestion was open, like a tavern. Miss the window, you'd suffer indigestion, dreams lingering in your gut like bad tenants. What graced the aristocratic breakfast table? Toasted bread rubbed with garlic, spiced pottage, milk punch, and occasionally dried eel strips. Yes, eel. Because nothing says, I'm better than peasants, like chewing rubbery river serpent at dawn. But regardless of class, people agreed on one thing. Breakfast had to be eaten with intention. This was the meal most vulnerable to spiritual interference, especially if you'd had vivid or disturbing dreams the night before. Some people believed you had to seal your dream state with the first bite. Otherwise, the residue of the night, memories, spirits, even sins could bleed into the daylight hours. Thus began the tradition of the silent breakfast. In many households, no one spoke during the first 10 minutes of the meal. This was a time of digestive calibration, when your body decided whether today would be a triumph or a flatulent disaster. People also avoided making eye contact during this period. Why? Because dreams could leak through the eyes. It was believed that if you locked eyes with someone who had suffered a nightmare, their bad luck or even their sleep demons could transfer into your own morning. So you eat your bread in peace, staring slightly to the left of your cousin and wondering if she still dreams of burning goats. The utensils don't help much either. Forks were around but still controversial, considered by some to be an effeminate Italian affectation and by others to be tools that pierced food in ways unholy. So most people relied on knives and fingers, which, in the sleepy morning blur, often resulted in stained sleeves and quiet weeping over gravy stains. Still, you manage. You sip something hot, perhaps small beer if you're a laborer. Yes, beer for breakfast, low alcohol, barely fermented, but safer than water. Or a thin herbal tisane if you're from a family that pronounces herbal without the H. Tea was acceptable, but only if served in teacups that hadn't recently hosted a spider. And just as you're starting to feel normal again, someone ruins it. Because someone always says, "Did anyone hear the child crying last night?" Everyone freezes. Now here's where it gets fun. phantom child cries were one of the most widely reported breakfast omens of the era. Hearing the cry of a child at night when no child lived nearby meant different things depending on where you were. In rural Ireland, it meant a fairy child had been stolen, and someone's crops would fail unless a silver coin was buried before dusk. In parts of Germany, it foretold a coming illness in the household, usually targeting the youngest. And in England, it was often interpreted as a ghost child, seeking a name, a grave, or just a proper breakfast. Naturally, after someone mentions it, no one eats much. A few households developed breakfast countercharms for this. One involved biting the edge of the plate, then turning it clockwise 3 times. Another required you to spill a little milk on the floor and whisper, "Drink, child, and go." Simple, a bit theatrical, effective. Historians still argue whether it stopped hauntings or just encouraged poor table manners. In some towns, people even added protective herbs to their breakfast. Rosemary and bread, thyme and eggs, mugwort tea. Not because it tasted great, but because these herbs were believed to anchor the waking soul. You see, after dreaming all night, there was a sense that part of you might not have made it fully back. Breakfast wasn't just food. It was ritual grounding, a way to make sure that you were you again. And while modern science would scoff, there's something oddly poetic about it. Breakfast as a handshake between body and spirit, or at least a truce brokered over slightly stale toast. But there's one more thing to consider before you rush off into your 18th century day. Your breath. No, really. Breath was believed to carry the residue of dreams, and not just yours. Sharing morning breath with someone could allow their nightmares to cling to you. Some couples, especially among the superstitious nobility, refused to kiss before breakfast, citing ancient texts and digestive equilibrium as excuses. Of course, the more cynical explanation is that no one in this era had proper dental hygiene, and kissing before breakfast was just horrifying. Whatever the reason, the message was clear. Until food passed your lips and sealed your fate, you weren't safe. So you sit back, your breakfast mostly consumed, your spiritual balance momentarily restored. You haven't angered any ghosts, accidentally adopted someone's nightmare, or eaten eel this morning. That's a win. But as the fire dims in the hearth and your neighbor knocks at the door with an armful of damp lettuce, you remember, the day is long and food is never neutral. In section 16, we step out into the broader world to explore how mealtime paranoia spilled into public life, why dinner invitations were political gambits, who refused to eat with whom, and what happened when someone brought a cucumber to court.
Section 16. You step outside, the cool air brushing against your cheeks like a cat that tolerates you but isn't quite ready to cuddle. The day has begun. You've survived the night, the dreams, the treacherous eel strips, and now you must navigate a world where food is not just food, it's a weapon, a message, a code. Welcome to 18th century public dining, where every mouthful is layered with meaning, and every invitation comes with strings, and possibly a faint whiff of betrayal. In a society where salad could be fatal after sunset, allegedly, imagine what kind of chaos unfolded when people started eating together. Let's start at the top. The aristocracy. To be invited to dine with a noble was not just a social honor, it was often a form of testing your loyalty. Seating arrangements were militarized. Place cards didn't exist yet, but everyone knew that if you were seated too far from the roast goose and too close to the pickled beets, someone in that house didn't like you. Conversations were carefully curated. You could discuss literature, politics, but only the boring parts, or weather, always safe. But food itself, that was tricky.
Ask too many questions about what's in the pudding, and someone might assume you think they're trying to poison you, which, to be fair, they might be. You were expected to eat politely, but without gusto. Excessive appetite was considered vulgar, while refusal to touch a particular dish could be taken as a direct insult to the cook, the host, or even the house ghost, depending on the family. And then there were vegetables. Yes, vegetables. Eating greens in public, especially salad, was a tense subject, particularly after sundown. The fear wasn't just of indigestion, but of social humiliation. Some diners viewed lettuce as unsteady food, meaning it was prone to spiritual or humoral interference. If you took a bite and happened to cough, hiccup, or heaven forbid, burp, the entire table might pause in horror, as though you just recited an exorcism backwards. This explains the infamous case of Baron Eldwick of Herefordshire, who in 1723 brought a whole cucumber to a late-night dinner at the Duke's residence. It was meant as a joke. It was not received that way. The cucumber sat untouched on a silver tray while guests tried not to look directly at it. A maid fainted. One elderly cousin claimed he saw the green glimmer of Satan's eyelid in its glossy skin. The cucumber was later buried in the garden with salt and a prayer. Historians still argue whether the Baron was socially exiled or merely sent to the countryside for quiet reflection. But either way, no one ever brought cucumbers to dinner again. These weren't isolated superstitions. They were expressions of a broader anxiety, the fear that what entered your body could change you, for better or worse. Even public feasts and festivals, while loud and colorful, operated on strict, unwritten rules. Take the harvest festivals in rural France, where townsfolk would gather for long communal meals of stews, breads, and seasonal produce. Everyone brought something to share, but if someone's contribution was too green, too raw, or arrived too late in the day, they might be politely excused from the table and impolitely discussed for years afterward. And while we're on the topic of being excused, let's talk about the fear of shared utensils. Forks, as we've noted, were still earning their place in society. Spoons and knives were communal at many taverns, and napkins were often shared or absent entirely. This meant that eating in public carried a real risk of microbial gossip. Not that people knew what microbes were, but they definitely knew when someone's mouth felt, cursed. To protect themselves, some carried personal eating kits, little velvet pouches with a preferred spoon, a folding knife, and a cloth that may or may not have been doused in rosemary water. These kits were often embroidered and were considered a mark of class and caution. In fact, a well-worn spoon was more trustworthy than a flattering compliment. At the other end of the spectrum were taverns and public houses where food was consumed fast, with fingers and washed down with so much ale that hygiene became a distant concept. But even here, people had rules. Don't eat anything with visible greens after dark. Don't sit under a rafter where cats have nested. Don't take stew from the left side of the pot. It's the shadow side. These weren't just tavern quirks. They were folk protections, centuries of oral tradition simmered down into table etiquette. Now, imagine being a diplomat in this world. Imagine sitting down at a table with foreign dignitaries from Austria, Italy, or the Ottoman Empire, each with their own culinary fears and preferences. The stress was immense. Whole meals were orchestrated by teams of cooks and servants whose job wasn't just to make good food, but not to offend the unseen superstitions of 20 different households. There's even a record of a peace treaty in Prussia being delayed 3 hours because no one would touch the carrots until someone confirmed they had been peeled clockwise. That's real power, the ability of a root vegetable to derail international diplomacy. Meanwhile, ordinary people developed their own rituals for eating with others. In some villages, people exchanged salt before meals, not just to flavor the food, but to confirm mutual trust. Refusing to take someone's salt was a serious insult, on par with calling their ox unhandsome. Some travelers carried tiny bells, which they bring just before eating in an unfamiliar house. This was believed to disrupt any food-bound hexes. Did it work? Again, hard to say, but it certainly made dinners louder.
And then, of course, there were the urban legends. Tales whispered in city streets of noblemen who were slowly driven mad after attending cursed banquets. Of cooks who prepared perfectly innocent meals but were later accused of murder because someone had a bad dream and a worse bowel movement. Of widows who never aged because they only ate soup in private and never touched salad, not even once. Because salad wasn't just feared at night, it was feared in company. Too clean, too quiet, too raw, too untrustworthy. A boiled potato could be trusted, a roasted parsnip, noble. But lettuce had secrets. So you sit there across from someone you vaguely trust, sipping your ale and nibbling your bread, wondering whether the pottage in your bowl was stirred 3 times clockwise and once counterclockwise as required by the old charm. And when they ask you if you'll try the greens, you smile, politely decline, and change the subject to something safer, like war, or tax reform, or the local dog that barks at mirrors. In Section 17, we return home, to the kitchen itself. A place of comfort? Not quite. We'll explore how the 18th century kitchen was a realm of superstition, seduction, and very sharp knives. Keep your elbows off the table.
Section 17. You step into the kitchen, expecting warmth, maybe a fresh crust of bread, a gentle clatter of copper pans. Instead, what greets you is smoke, superstition, and the lingering possibility that something in the cupboard is not quite of this world. Because in the 18th century, the kitchen isn't just where food is made. It's where magic happens, both the comforting kind and the kind that makes you avoid eye contact with the root vegetables. Let's start with the layout. A typical European kitchen of this era is dark. Not moody Pinterest dark, actual dark. Lighting is mostly fire, open hearth, candles, maybe an oil lamp if someone hasn't knocked it over trying to shoo a cat. Windows are small and fogged with decades of steam and bacon grease. Everything smells faintly of onions and something burnt that no one can quite identify. The hearth is the center of the kitchen, both literally and spiritually. It's where meals are cooked, families gather, and, according to an alarming number of regional legends, unwanted spirits like to hang out. There's a reason many homes placed a small iron nail in the hearthstone to pin the presence of wandering hunger so it wouldn't roam the house. But it's not just ghosts that people worry about in here. It's the food itself. Because even before you chop or boil anything, ingredients are already loaded with meaning. Take salt. Universally feared, loved, and deeply misunderstood. Salt had to be stored in ceramic, not metal, or else it would absorb envy. Dropping salt was bad luck. You knew that. But where you dropped it mattered too. Left side, death in the family. Right side, financial trouble. Both sides, you probably shouldn't eat anything you cook tonight. To reverse the curse, many households practice the 3-flick method. You take a pinch of salt and toss it over each shoulder and one under the table just in case the devil is hiding, which seems rude but fair. Now let's talk about bread dough. Kneading dough wasn't just labor, it was performance art. You had to fold it in a certain rhythm, always in one direction. Kneading against the sun's movement, yes, really, could cause the dough to rise into sorrow. A loaf with too many bubbles, that was a sign someone in the household was lying. More than one family reportedly interrogated a child because the bread came out too airy. And then, of course, there was meat. If you were lucky enough to afford it regularly, you'd want to season it with intention. Not just salt and herbs, but also words, quiet prayers, short spells. Some people whispered the name of the animal 3 times as they salted the flesh to return honor to its form. Others refused to speak at all while preparing meat, fearing that a wandering spirit might overhear and claim the dish for itself.
Honestly, with all this silent seasoning, it's a wonder anyone spoke at all in the kitchen. But let's say you're not the cook. You're a guest, or maybe a child poking around while your grandmother is stirring something that smells vaguely of both carrots and vengeance. There are rules here, too. First, never whistle. Whistling in the kitchen was believed to summon wind, literal or metaphysical. You'd either ruin the soup or invite a kitchen poltergeist named something like Barty who knocks over your salt and Snickers. Second, don't point at the oven. It was considered the eye of the house, and pointing at it could cause it to go cold or bake unevenly. Some people even covered it with a cloth when not in use, like a haunted parrot cage. Third, never count the eggs aloud. You'd think this would help with inventory, but saying the number out loud could lock the luck. Some believed it also tempted jealous spirits to make one egg rot or hatch prematurely. Either way, unpleasant at breakfast. Still with me? Because now we must speak of knives. A knife in the kitchen was not just a tool. It was a line of power. Cooks believed their personal knives held their mood, so a blade used in anger would cut the meal wrong. That could mean tough meat, watery stew, or, in extreme cases, your guests dreaming about rats. A dropped knife foretold a visitor, but again, which way it landed mattered. Point toward the door, a stranger. Toward the hearth, someone close, possibly bearing bad news. Flat on the floor, just clumsiness. You're allowed one mystery per day. Oh, and you never, ever hand a knife directly to another person. Place it on the table, let them pick it up. Otherwise, you risk cutting the friendship. There's actually a recorded incident in 1762 of two noblewomen ceasing all contact because one passed the other a butter knife. Harsh, but butter is serious business. Now let's take a moment to look up. Hanging from the beams above are bundles of herbs: sage, thyme, lavender, wormwood. Part preservation, part pest control, but also a defense system. These herbs were believed to absorb kitchen quarrels, bless the bread, and prevent accidents involving fire. Not to be dramatic, but the average 18th century kitchen was part restaurant, part church, part haunted apothecary. And still, despite all this superstition, or maybe because of it, the kitchen was a place of strange comfort. A ritualistic laboratory where food and meaning were stirred into every pot. People gathered here even when they didn't need to. They sat near the fire with their hands wrapped around mugs of something warm. They whispered, they wept, they peeled apples with unreasonable precision. The kitchen saw more real life than any drawing room or parlor. It was also, occasionally, a space for seduction. Yes, seduction. If you really like someone, you didn't write a poem. You invited them to taste your stew. You let them stir the sauce, knead the dough, slice the roots. Tasks so intimate, they were bordering on scandalous. Letting someone taste from your spoon, that was basically a public declaration of desire. If someone let you near their spice rack, you were practically engaged. Historians still debate whether kitchens held more secrets than bedrooms. Honestly, it's close. But like all powerful places, the kitchen had its dark side. Fires were common, so were burns, accidents, and occasionally alleged possessions. A few records survive of cursed kettles that screamed when touched, or baking bowls that would not empty. Were these real? Probably not. But the fear was real enough to change behavior. Which brings us rather inevitably to salad. Yes, even in the kitchen, perhaps especially there, lettuce was handled with gloves or togs, washed 3 times in separate basins, and left to dry beneath a white cloth embroidered with protective symbols. If it made its way into a meal, it was likely disguised. chopped, boiled, served with vinegar and garlic to purify the leaf. Raw salad was a high-risk dish, prepared only on certain days by certain people in certain moods, because you never know what might be clinging to the edges of a damp romaine. So you look around this kitchen, smoky, chaotic, half-whispered, and realize it's more than a room. It's a threshold between safety and danger, ritual and chaos, memory and forgetfulness. And maybe that's why so many stories begin and end here. In section 18, we turn our eyes towards medicine and food, a tangled mess of alchemy, superstition, and accidental poisonings. We'll examine what 18th century healers prescribed, what people swallowed on purpose, and why salad could sometimes be considered a gateway to madness.
Section 18. You lean over a counter, still damp from washing, stare at a bottle that smells faintly of fennel and despair, and wonder, is this medicine or soup? Welcome to 18th century Europe, where the line between kitchen and apothecary is thinner than a parsley sprig and about as trustworthy. Here, food isn't just sustenance. It's treatment, prevention, and, occasionally, a deeply miscalculated cure. That pot of onion broth your neighbor insists will clear your lungs? It might. Or it might cause hallucinations, depending on whether she added bishop's weed or bishop's actual hair. Let's begin with the truth. Medicine in this era is messy. Not metaphorically, literally messy. Think crushed snails, burnt feathers, powdered horn. These are serious ingredients, prepared by serious people with very little agreement on what they're doing. Medical schools exist, sure, but most people, especially outside cities, rely on folk healers, grannies, and people who once read part of a Latin herbology manual and now consider themselves experts. The result, a dinner table that often doubles as a sickbed. If your stomach hurts, you don't take a pill. You eat a hot onion, soaked in vinegar, or a handful of boiled dandelion roots, or a mysterious blend of spices with a name like Pox Be Gone. Sometimes it helps. Sometimes you get hives and have to be treated again, with wine, or leeches, or, bizarrely, cold lettuce tea. Yes, lettuce again. In medical texts of the time, lettuce was praised for its cooling qualities. Cooling being shorthand for, this might calm you down, or kill your appetite or spirit. In fact, many believed lettuce could drain the vital energies, which is precisely why it was feared after sunset, when you needed those energies most to ward off dreams, demons, and midnight stomach gremlins. Doctors, real ones mind you, warned against eating raw greens at night, claiming they could lead to melancholia, nightmares, and even temporary insanity. This wasn't fringe. It was printed, cited, debated, and taken very, very seriously. But while salad was suspicious, other oddities were enthusiastically consumed in the name of health. Mercury, for instance. Yes, that mercury. Used in salves, pills, and sometimes as a liquid to purge heat or balance the humors. It worked in that it made you sweat, shake, vomit, and sometimes forget your name. But hey, if your original problem was too much bile, this might technically solve it. Historians still argue whether patients believed in mercury or simply feared their doctors enough to swallow anything handed to them in a silver spoon. Then there's bloodletting. Not food-related per se, but often followed by a light meal of broth and greens, which, ironically, could undo the whole point of the procedure if your salad contained certain heating herbs. Some barbers were trained to both cut your hair and open your vein. One popular sequence went shave, slice, soup. Yes, truly a spa day. Other cures involved alcohol, a lot of it. Wine, beer, mead, even distilled spirits were recommended for everything from toothaches to heartbreak. A dram a day keeps the ghost away, said one 1730s pamphlet, suspiciously funded by a tavern guild. This wasn't just indulgence. People genuinely believed alcohol could sterilize the gut,
warm the blood, and chase away night chills. Which brings us back, in a roundabout way, to salad, because mixing wine with raw vegetables was considered dangerous. The wine, hot and lively, might clash with the salad's cool and damp qualities, creating, wait for it, internal thunder. A metaphor, possibly, but some texts describe patients hearing sounds of boiling in their own stomachs. And if that's not terrifying enough to make you skip the vinaigrette, nothing is. Now, if you were wealthy, you had options. You could hire a physician, an apothecary, or even a culinary healer, someone whose whole job was to prepare meals that aligned with your ailments and astrological profile. These professionals consulted elaborate charts and ancient Greek texts before recommending, say, a stew of lentils, clove, and saffron, or poached pears with ground coral and a side of regret. Middle-class families often kept medical recipe books, passed down through generations. These weren't just for cakes. They contained instructions for tonics, salves, thick soups for despair, and even anti-scurvy candies. One such recipe read, "To relieve the melancholy spirit, steep fennel in honeyed ale, whisper your sorrow into the glass, and drink at dawn." Quaint? Effective? Who knows? Rural folks relied on herb women, many of whom operated in a legally gray area. These women knew every root, leaf, and seed within a 10-mile radius. They could cure your cough, ease childbirth, and, accidentally, poison your neighbor. Although that last bit was usually reserved for very specific disputes over goats. And all of them had firm opinions about when to eat salad. Some said never. Others allowed it at sunrise if they've churched in moonlight. The salad, not you. Others insisted it could be consumed, but only with bitter herbs and a confession. Then there was the noble class, prone to excess and experimental health fads. One aristocrat reportedly dined exclusively on sun-dried spinach biscuits for 3 weeks to purge himself of excess melancholia, then fainted while playing a harpsichord and was revived by a spoonful of garlic custard. Medical consensus? Unclear. Beneath all this herbal chaos and spice-laden self-diagnosis, there was a common thread. The belief that food could change your mood, your body, even your fate. So much so that people wrote elaborate spells into their cooking routines. To bless a meal, you might stir clockwise while humming a specific psalm. To rid a pot of bad luck, add 3 whole peppercorns and burn the spoon afterwards. To cleanse meal prepared in anger, pass the dish beneath a curtain of rosemary smoke. Was any of this science? Not really. But it was practiced, earnestly, obsessively, and across centuries. And it reveals something profound. Eating was never just about hunger. It was about power, fear, hope, control. You didn't just eat for nourishment. You ate to heal, to hide, to protect, to feel something. Which is why lettuce remained so threatening. Because it defied control. It grew easily, hid dirt in its folds, resisted cooking, changed texture without warning. It was everything a healer feared. Damp, deceptive, unpredictable. And worst of all, it looked harmless. That's the thing about the most terrifying ingredients. They don't announce themselves with smoke or claws. They sit quietly in the bowl, waiting. In section 19, we'll step away from the fires and tonics and peer into the social mind, how shared beliefs about salad reflected deeper anxieties about class, gender, and identity in the 18th century Europe. Spoiler, lettuce was surprisingly political.
Section 19. You sit in a candlelit salon, silk cuffs brushing the polished arms of your chair. The air smells of bergamot, beeswax, and just a trace of anxiety. A footman passes trays of delicacies, tiny tarts, sugared almonds, a wedge of aspic that trembles ominously. But your gaze is fixed on a modest bowl at the table center. Salad. It's green, it's glistening, and no one is touching it. In this world of powdered wigs and powdered faces, what you eat and when says more about your identity than your accent, your estate, or even your teeth. Welcome to the politics of salad. 18th century Europe was obsessed with hierarchy, not just socially, but gastronomically. Foods were ranked, classified, and socially coded. Boiled meat, working class. Game fowl in wine reduction, upper crust. Raw vegetables, well, that's where it gets thorny. To many in the elite class, raw greens were associated with peasantry, the lower humors of society. Farmers ate salad. Villagers forged dandelions. Laborers gnawed on turnip greens with calloused fingers. The upper class, they had cooks to boil and blanch and roast every threat out of their vegetables. So eating salad was in a way performing poverty. Not a good look when you're wearing 2 pounds of embroidery and just took out a small loan for your powdered wig. This isn't to say aristocrats never ate raw greens. They did, but carefully and with considerable flourish. The trick was to dress them up, literally. Lettuce leaves might be candied, perfumed, layered beneath jewels carved from marzipan. One 1740s menu described a lettuce dome filled with whipped egg white and lark tongues. Is it still a salad? Who knows? But it was served by a man in a brocade waistcoat, so no one asked. Meanwhile, gender norms played a curiously large role in who feared salad and why. Men were expected to eat hot, vigorous foods, meats, wines, heavy stews that suggested strength and virility. A man caught nibbling a raw leaf after sundown? He might as well announce he's made of lace and poetry. Women, on the other hand, were seen as naturally cooler, in temperament, in blood, in perceived intellect. Salad, being a cool food, was considered especially dangerous to them. Some medical guides warned that women who consumed too much raw greenery might become infertile, or overly emotional, or worse, uppity, the horror. Others feared salad could cool the womb, a phrase that appears far too often in 18th century writings and not once in modern gynecology for good reason. Cool wombs, they said, produced melancholy babies, if any babies at all. Historians still argue whether these warnings were sincerely believed or just a convenient excuse to control women's diets, and therefore their behavior. Either way, salad became a symbol of feminine mystery, danger, even rebellion. And then came the garden movement. Late in the century, there was a growing trend toward natural living, a response to the artificiality of court life. People began growing their own vegetables, eating closer to the land, even, gasp, embracing salad. But it was still coded. To eat salad and be praised for it, you had to frame it properly. I eat greens not as a farmer's wife, but as a student of nature's divine rhythm. Translation, I'm not poor, I'm poetic. This thin line between aesthetic choice and social rebellion meant salad never quite lost its edge. Even as Enlightenment thinkers championed natural diets, the memory of lettuce's shady past lingered. To this day, echoes remain. Think about how we describe leafy greens. Clean eating, raw foodism, detoxing. There's still a moral undercurrent, a faint judgment hidden beneath the fork. And once upon a time, that judgment might have gotten you uninvited from a masquerade ball. So, the next time someone offers you a salad, remember, it's not just a bowl of leaves. It's centuries of fear, status, gender anxiety, and botanical symbolism, served with a splash of olive oil and a long, suspicious glance.
Section 20. You sit back, full now, not of food, but of the strange, simmering stew that was 18th century Europe's relationship with salad. It's late. A hush has fallen over the parlor. Candles flicker lower. Somewhere outside, a cat yowls like it's seen a ghost, or worse, a lettuce leaf after sundown. Let's bring everything together. You've wandered through moonlit gardens, watched vegetables bloom and fade, listened to physicians mumble about coolness and melancholy, and seen noblemen flinch at the sight of a cucumber. You've stood in smoky kitchens, peered into pewter bowls of vinegared leaves, and heard the whispered warnings from grandmothers, monks, and midwives, all over a salad. What began as a simple leafy side dish unfolded into something far more tangled, a mirror of cultural fears and a tool to define the self in a world both obsessed with order and terrified of what lurked just outside it. Because salad, innocent, unruly, raw, defied control. In a time when nearly everything had its place, when people were measured by their clothes, their accent, their forks and posture, salad refused to fit the mold. It wasn't cooked, it wasn't measured, it wasn't predictable. And at night, when boundaries blurred, when candles burned low and shadows played tricks on the floorboards, salad became a kind of quiet threat. Not a loud, dramatic one, but a soft, insistent one. The kind that creeps in on tiptoe and plants unease in your belly. You see, fear of salad wasn't just about digestion. It was fear of what might happen when you stop following the rules. When you reach for something wild, unboiled, unblessed, unbothered. Historians still argue whether the fear was rooted in real cases of illness or simply symbolic panic. Most likely it was both. A few cases of bad lettuce turned into superstition, which fermented into doctrine, which settled into the dusty corners of custom. And then there's the irony. While elite Europe spent decades fretting about leaves, revolution was bubbling underfoot. Social upheaval, intellectual shifts, the breaking of orders, the toppling of monarchies. The salad, it turns out, was just the appetizer. By the end of the 1700s, Enlightenment thinkers had begun to peel back old fears, challenge the rigidity of custom, and quietly place a single raw leaf on their plate without flinching. How brave, one might say, watching a French philosopher dip a sprig of watercress into oil and pop it in his mouth. A revolution in 4 bites. Of course, it didn't stick immediately. Superstitions lingered. Even into the 19th century, you'll find scattered reports of doctors warning against lettuce fevers or night salads, particularly in rural areas. Habits die hard, especially when they're mixed with fear and tradition, then soaked in vinegar and wrapped in linen. But you made it through. You listened to the whispers, wandered the gardens, squinted at the scrawled recipes, and survived the leafy threat. Which is more than we can say for poor Lady Mallory, who once mistook a bowl of parsley for mint, fainted dramatically, and had to be revived with a warm roast partridge. You've earned your rest. And now, before we drift into the wind down, let's leave you with one final, slippery, lingering truth. Fear, like lettuce, grows in clusters. It curls in on itself, folds layers over layers, until what seems soft and safe becomes something darker, stranger, more uncertain. But also, like lettuce, it can be unwrapped, slowly, gently, and with enough curiosity and maybe a splash of good oil, it becomes not something to fear, but something to savor. So, tonight, as you lie back beneath your covers, let the strangeness settle. Let the candles gutter and the hum of the fan take over. And let's wrap this tale, leaf by leaf, in the softness of night.
And now, as we ease out of these curious tales of lettuce and lore, let your breath slow just a little. You've journeyed through crumbling kitchens and echoing ballrooms, along garden paths veiled in mist,
and past the wary eyes of powdered nobles debating the virtue of a spinach leaf. The candles have gone out, one by one, and the house stands quiet, its fears folded away like linens in a drawer. Outside, the night stretches soft and long, like a forgotten lullaby. Trees sway faintly in the dark. The sky, deep with stars, makes no sound. Even the wind seems to tiptoe, careful not to wake you. Let your shoulders drop. Let your thoughts drift, not with purpose, not toward anything, but like feathers on a still lake. You don't have to remember the names, or the theories, or the odd recipes. Just hold on to the feeling that history, even at its strangest, has room for laughter, wonder, and the slow comfort of drifting off. Tomorrow, you can eat your salad whenever you like. But tonight, let it rest. Let you rest. Breathe in the quiet, breathe out the questions. Nothing to solve, nothing to fix. Just the cool, sweet hush of a story finished, and a pillow waiting beneath your cheek. So good night, brave traveler of weird tales. Sleep deeply, dream strangely, and when the morning comes, don't worry, there's no lettuce in your breakfast. End of script. Sweet dreams.